I woke up one morning. It was winter. I could see an oak tree standing right next to me. It was cold.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage our moderator for this session, CNN and Daily Beast contributor, Kimberly Dozier.
Good morning. Good morning, everyone. Thank you to the Atlantic Dialogues for sponsoring this event. And I want to welcome our speakers onto the stage who will be engaging in some real back and forth, I hope, on the Trump administration and its policy towards NATO and also towards the region. So first, we have Michelle Ndiaye, who is the director of the Africa Peace and Security Program at the Institute for Peace and Security Studies of Addis Ababa University. And next we have Ahmedou Ould Abdallah, the former foreign minister and director of C4S of the Republic of Mauritania. After him, we have, I know the dinner last night was great, so we're all taking a little bit to get going. So then we have J. Peter Pham, the United States Special Envoy for the Great Lakes region of Africa, and also Vice President for Research and Regional Initiatives and Director of the Africa Center at the Atlantic Council in Washington. Peter. And we have Bruno Tertrais, the Deputy Director of the Foundation for Strategic Research in Paris. And finally, Joao Vale del Almeida, Ambassador of the EU to the United Nations. And he told me in advance, don't worry, my name has been mangled several times, so very gracious. So with that, I actually want to engage all of you. We have a word cloud to kick off with. So if you look at your apps and go to the home page, 3 or 4 categories down, you'll see a space that says word cloud. So you can press on that. And the question I have for you is, what is the #1 impediment to a strong NATO alliance and the transatlantic order? So while you all find that, I will turn to our speakers and ask Michelle to start. What do you find is the #1 impediment to a strong NATO alliance, which of course goes with our question for this panel, can NATO survive the shifting political order?
Thank you, Kimberly. I think we have perhaps to take a little bit of a historical drive to come back to why NATO was formed in the first place, and can it survive this order? I believe, and I would like to quote a recent report from the Munich Security Conference, and the title was very appealing. The world is less liberal, less international, and less orderly. And in a less orderly world, of course, it's very difficult for NATO to survive in the way it is today as an organization, as a military cooperation organization. And I think we need to look at it from that perspective. When you are in a more orderly world, of course, you need a champion. And when that champion doesn't play the role anymore, then you have to move towards a coalition of willing. And I think the question, to respond to the question, we should say yes or no. And the yes for me is that coalition of willing should continue to take NATO to the next level, which is to adjust to the current security landscape, which is unprecedentedly a difficult landscape we have never experienced. And I think, for me, that's really what is important. This collective security that is important for those coalition of willing when you don't have anymore a champion, a gendarme, that could actually play the role of those equilibrium that is needed. And what is important is really to come back to the issue of collective security. There is no more state security and human security if your neighbors are not secure. And I think for me that's really what we need to learn from this current order.
So by no more champion or gendarme, who are you talking about?
Well, the US, of course.
Okay. Peter, we'll get to you. But let's go to Minister Abdallah.
Well, I'm from a generation who, as a student and an active person, grew up under the NATO and its counterpart, the Warsaw Pact. For a number of reasons, I saw NATO not as a military alliance, but member state as promoting freedom, liberties, and economic development, though in countries covered, like my region, it was one-party system, restriction of freedom, restriction of economy, and so on. Therefore, politically, to me, Warsaw Pact was a one-party system, oppression, and when it collapsed, it was a success of freedom, and especially of NATO and its member states. Now, the discussion, the debate about possibility of NATO dismantling or weakening by its own promoter is a reminder of that period when Soviet Union collapsed and Warsaw Pact disappeared. Is US policy today threatening its own built, funded alliance, as Gorbachev and his own people did to the NATO? So I'm at this question, though the debate is more open within the NATO alliance, the threat or the comparison could not be excluded.
Peter, that leads nicely into you.
Well, let me first begin, Kim, by putting the obvious that I'm here speaking about NATO in my personal capacity, not as an official of the U.S. government. But that being said, I think the biggest impediment to NATO's sustainability, durability in the long haul is the failure of some of the member states to adapt to their and to uphold their commitments. 4 years ago, at the Wales summit, the NATO alliance committed itself, each member state, to spending 2% of GDP on defense as their contribution. Today, only 5 NATO states, the United States, the United Kingdom, Poland, Greece, and Estonia, meet that threshold. More than half of the alliance, 16 of the 29 members of the alliance, don't even spend 1.5% of GDP. And some of them, even to get to 1.5, you have to throw in pensions, military pensions as military spending. That's not sustainable, not only because of the alliance itself has needs across the board to face the new threats which exist, but also politically sustainable. The American taxpayer is not going to continue. President Trump expresses it in one way, but this is something that previous administrations, President Obama, his Secretary of Defense, Bob Gates expressed this in his valedictory address. So it's something that actually is bipartisan in the United States, this political support, but requires our partners meeting us.
Bruno.
Biggest impediments, I would say there are 2 of them. Mistrust and misunderstanding. Misunderstanding about what NATO is about, and unfortunately, the leader of NATO, the de facto leader of NATO, that is the American president, shows no sign of understanding what NATO is about. And the second biggest impediment is mistrust. There's a lot of mistrust across the Atlantic from the United States about what Europe wants or is ready to do, wants to do regarding its own military plans, and it's true the other way around. Of course, Europe mistrusts, for good or bad reasons, the US administration. I would be tempted to add lack of US leadership, but the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, just said in an extraordinary speech that I encourage you all to read. Some of you may like it, others will not like it, but I thought it was a very important speech. Mike Pompeo claims that there's actually a renewed US leadership in the Transatlantic Alliance in the world, the free world, quote unquote, reclaiming national sovereignty. I'm not sure this is what the Transatlantic Alliance is about, but at least there's a claim. Just one word about the 2%. I'm one of those who always thought that 2% was pure fetishism. It's not a good criteria. 2% of GDP doesn't say nothing about what your armed forces are willing and able to do. It turns out that you're right. It is a collective commitment, and you have to uphold collective commitment. I'm not sure it's a good idea to focus on that specific number. It depends a lot on, it doesn't say anything about what your armed forces are ready to do, and it even says less about what your political leadership is ready to do to uphold the political commitments of the Atlantic Alliance. And this whole, this list of questions that I've raised pose a bigger problem, which is maybe the biggest impediment. NATO to sustain itself must prove to be an effective deterrent, because collective defense is bread and butter for the Atlantic Alliance. That's what NATO was made for. And if we project, we, the members of the Atlantic Alliance, project an image of disunity, it's not good for deterrence. And there's one country, one person in particular, who absolutely loves what's going on within NATO these days, which has been everything which has been happening in NATO over the past 18 months, and it's of course Russia.
Peter, if I may just have Ambassador de Almeida.
Good morning. Thank you very much. As an acting ambassador, I have to start saying that everything I'll say today is on my personal capacity and does not necessarily reflect the views of the European Union. Secondly, I'm not a spokesman for NATO, far from that, but I'd like to be very clear. My reply to your question, whether NATO will survive, is a resounding yes. I don't have a shadow of a doubt that NATO will survive. For very simple reasons. It represents the will of the countries that have signed the North Atlantic Treaty. It represents a system of values that we stand for and will stand for, regardless of presidents and prime ministers and kings and queens. It's stronger than that. But in order to survive and to remain relevant and effective, NATO needs to adapt to the new challenges. I think the biggest challenge for NATO is the new context post the annexation of Crimea. The new context post the breaking of the consensus that we thought were sustainable, the ones we reached after the end of the Cold War. It's the new threats, hybrid wars, cyber attacks, non-state actors, the links between terrorism and trafficking and organized crime, everything that happens in our neighborhood. These are the real challenges. But as a European, I, again, don't have a shadow of a doubt that NATO will survive. It will adapt to the circumstances, and it will go well beyond the present doubts. And those who, and there are a few, countries and leaders that would like to see NATO implode, I think they should remember Mark Twain's comment about the announcement of his own death. Largely exaggerated.
So, we have Michelle, who says it's a dangerous world and perhaps regional actors need to step up to defend themselves in the absence of U.S. leadership. We have Minister Ahmedou expressing similar sentiments. Bruno saying the U.S. has basically abandoned international and multilateral institutions.
That's not quite what I said.
Oh, okay. But you are saying that NATO will survive, but why not make some tweaks to it? Peter, you're saying the U.S. has shouldered enough of the burden for long enough.
No, that's not what I'm saying, Kim. What I'm saying is, in order to I agree fully with Joe. NATO needs to adapt to hybrid conflicts, to all these new challenges. But it also needs to adapt to the political environment in which we live. And part of that, and perhaps the 2% has been fetishized. I don't necessarily disagree with you on that. But it was a 2% that was adapted by everyone by consensus. And it goes to that issue of trust which you raise. It's precisely that the voters at home in the United States, question, this agreement was made, it's not being honored, and the political support necessary in a democracy to sustain an ongoing partnership like this requires that popular legitimacy. And that's why I'm saying it's threatening to it.
Peter, did you know, if I may, domestic political support, domestic support in US public opinion for NATO has never been higher. So there's no doubt. You may have doubts in Congress or in the political class, but in the US public opinion, voters, they trust NATO, they support NATO. So I don't think the problem comes from that.
I would disagree. Our voters largely never vote in the U.S. on foreign policy issues.
Public polls. We're talking about polls.
Just on this one, I cannot prevent myself from stepping in. And the point is the following. I think there's a you can use either a very narrow lens or a wide lens. I think the 2% is the narrower lens you can find. It's a very narrow approach to security. To define security and measure the degree of commitment or effectiveness in securing your own countries by the level of military spending is a very narrow way of approaching it. And I give you a few examples of what we do in Europe to contribute to the security of Europe, to the security of the neighborhood, to the security of the United States, which doesn't have anything to do with 2% of military spending. And the first example I give you is what we did to enlarge the European Union. Enlarging to 28 countries, bringing in countries that were behind the Iron Curtain, is a fundamental, substantial contribution to security in Europe. Is a fundamental, substantial contribution to security, to global security, to our rapport de force with other partners around the world. I take development aid. There is a security dimension in development aid. We put on development aid more than the rest of the world together. Is this counted as 2%?
So
What do we do on climate change? Everybody knows American military, and I dealt with them when I was ambassador in Washington many times. One of their top concerns is the security consequences of climate change. Who is doing more to fight climate change? Our countries that are doing that. There's nothing to do with 2% military spending. So just to make the point that I think we need to, in today's complex world, reducing the measurement of commitment to security to 2% is a very narrow way of looking at it. This being said, I fully agree what Peter and Bruno have said. Commitments are there to be fulfilled, to be respected. And if I can speak as a European, Europeans are on the track to respect those commitments.
Perhaps, Kimberly, I just want to come in on that. I think there is a second question to the first you just asked. I think there is also the need for assuring global peace. And what is the role that NATO should play in such a complex world to continue to actually cater for global peace? And I think that's the second question that we cannot answer for the moment. And I think Ambassador said that, yes, definitely NATO will survive. And I said yes and no, because I believe that currently, if you look at the complexity of the challenges, most security institutions have been struggling to adjust to the complexity of security challenges currently. And I would like to draw a parallel to say it's not only about NATO, it's about most of the security institutions that was actually have served their purpose. And after you have served your purpose, you're facing actually challenges that are completely new, and there is no drive internally to be able to adjust and respond to those drives. But for me, what is important is, even if NATO survives, global peace is at stake. If you look at it from the what I call the looming end of multilateralism today, combined with the difficulty to adjust to the new world, what will be the response to actually take care of global peace?
And yet, NATO has stepped into missions fighting terrorism. They have assisted in the conflict in, they've led the conflict in Libya and defeating Gaddafi there. They have also coalesced around a new rising threat from Russia. And just to take the counterpoint, as Peter is here on his own defending the Trump administration, one of the things that Secretary of Defense Mattis recently pointed out at the Reagan Forum was that the spending investment of NATO members has gone up by $40 billion with a B dollars since the Trump administration took office. So, you know, the counterpoint could be, yes, NATO had a schedule, the members had a schedule to meet eventual investment of 2% of their GDP in their own defense. But since President Trump changed the tone on how he asked from past American presidents, they have stepped up. And also, they have coalesced around a new rising threat from a nation state, Russia, which was their original purpose.
Can I just say, correlation is not causality, and I think that Vladimir Putin and Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi have done more for the 2% than Donald Trump.
Well, you know, the point I would like to make again is to keep comparing to Warsaw Pact. It was the same generation of alliances. I don't compare them. I don't compare the member states or their economies. The threat, the collapse of Warsaw Pact came from within, from the collapse of Soviet Union. I don't see, indeed, American collapsing. But if American defense and foreign policy decide to withdraw, the threat to NATO now is from the administration threatening its own member state policies of spending and so on. So I see the risk, or whatever you call it, as from within. If the American administration is not supportive of adaptation or new policies, there is a threat that NATO and indeed multilateralism be irrelevant or of no interest. And this is the same threat on United Nations, on the World Bank. So we keep only the military, but with the new funding, the Bank of Infrastructure by China and others, I wonder if the whole multilateralism system, including NATO, is not under threat.
And yet, Secretary of State Pompeo just gave a speech in Brussels where he talked about how he's inviting the members of NATO next spring to Washington. He did slam several of the institutions you just talked about, but the U.S. administration seems to have found that NATO is also useful for American interests, and they seem to be backing it as an institution. Joao?
I will not comment on any president or any secretary of state. I'm just saying there are two debates here. One is about NATO and whether it will survive or not, and my position, I think, is clear. The other one is about multilateralism. These are two different debates. Huh? NATO is a regional alliance. Multilateralism is much more than that. It's a different debate. So the questions around NATO have some links with the questions about multilateralism, but it's quite a different debate. And I share what our two colleagues said about the crisis of multilateralism. We are feeling that. I feel that in New York every day, and it's a great concern of ours, Europeans.
And we should absolutely pull the aperture of this panel back to that.
But just one point on why are Europeans spending more and doing the kind of things I was saying and more. We don't need anybody to tell us what we should do or not do. If we are doing this, it's because we feel that there are new threats very close to our borders, around the neighborhood, that needs to be addressed effectively. And you've seen in the last 2 years more progress on European defense and security than in the last 60 years of European integration. And this is an illustration of how much our governments and our cities and our public opinion is committed to ensure our security. But at the same time, the Treaty of Lisbon, from my hometown, which is the sort of constitution of the European Union, has in its article 42.7, if I'm not wrong, a clear statement saying NATO is the foundation of the security of Europeans. And this is enshrined in our treaty. So we are committed to NATO, committed to the security of our citizens, particularly concerned these days, and acting upon that concern to equip ourselves as EU, as members of NATO, in cooperation between the EU and NATO to ensure our collective defense. We don't need anybody to tell us what we should do on that front.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I don't like to monopolize, but it is very difficult in past, and especially now, international context, to make a clear separation between multilateralism and global security. NATO was a result of threat at World War II and the establishment of a whole international architecture, which brought in UN, World Bank, and the allies, and a threat, real or not, seen as coming from Soviet Union. If that threat has disappeared, if the promoter withdraw from multilateralism, I'm not personally a player in multilateralism, but I'm just saying there is a coherence. If one pillar of that coherence is threatened or disappear, NATO might be irrelevant.
And yet, Moscow, with its abrogation of the INF Treaty and other actions on stage, like the world stage, like Ukraine, the recent arrest of Ukrainian sailors and seizure of the Ukrainian naval vessels, seems to be providing, again, an organizing principle to continue forward, that at least Trump administration officials in public statements have found useful in their America First paradigm, right?
And I would say it's fortuitous that there is this now organizing principle. I think we did go listless for a few years when there was not clear what the threat was and what the nature, but I think we do have a threat, and in fact several, and I think that and the commitment to that is the basis on which to move forward. So in a way, not to be grateful for Vladimir Putin, but he has his uses.
So, yes, Bruno.
No, can I just clarify one thing? NATO is doing absolutely fine as a military organization. It's the Atlantic Alliance which is in trouble, okay? There is no doubt that the Trump administration, and specifically James Mattis's Pentagon, has been extremely forthcoming in ensuring and anchoring US military support to Europe. There's no doubt about that. There has not been any disinvestment, any military disinvestment of the United States from Europe under the Trump administration. But I think at this point of the conversation, it's useful to say NATO is a military organization, but we have this thing called the Atlantic Alliance, which is the broader political relationship between Europe and the United States, plus Canada. And this is where the problems are. We have trade agreements that the US administration, we just made a deal in July, and the US administration seems to be backwarding on this deal. We're supposed to have the same, if not the same interests and the same values, at least one of the two. And increasingly, a number of Europeans and Americans, I grant you that, are wondering whether these countries still have the same interests and the same values. So it's this strange disconnect that I find interesting these days in the transatlantic conversation between NATO as a military organization, which, including thanks to the US, is doing very well, is even thriving, and the Atlantic Alliance, which I think is in deep trouble.
Well, I would like to actually pivot to something that is Peter's job in the administration, which is the Africa strategy that Ambassador Bolton just rolled out yesterday. Some would argue that parts of that Africa strategy strengthen the Atlantic Alliance between the U.S. and Africa, others not so much. So, Peter, can you, for the audience here who might not have heard, can you describe it for us?
Well, let me make the comment that this should put to rest the canard, which has been around for a year and a half, that the United States government is not interested in Africa. Suffice to recall that it took the Obama administration, the first African-American president, 4 years to produce a document of on Africa. It was released in 2012. Less than 2 years into the Trump administration, we have one. And yesterday, the National Security Advisor, Ambassador John Bolton, unveiled it. It's based on 3 pillars. First, a whole new initiative, which we're calling Prosper Africa, to help increase U.S.-African business and commercial ties, building youth employment in Africa, growing the middle class, and recognizing that we both benefit from greater investment and trade. Secondly, resolving questions of security, not just fighting radical Islamist terrorism, but also conflicts that are ongoing within the continent, and working with our African partners to do that. And then thirdly, and perhaps this is the innovation and perhaps is the notion that our aid policy needs to be reviewed, and there's a promise for a new strategy to aid. But the organizing principle is going to be focus resources where they can achieve the most verifiable good results and prioritize them accordingly. And reviewing areas, as the administration has already done, where aid has not produced those outcomes. And in fact, as Ambassador Bolton in his speech yesterday referred to the government of, if it can be called a government, of South Sudan as morally bankrupt, where the U.S. has poured in the last 4 years alone $4 billion, primarily humanitarian aid, to a government that is itself causing the suffering of its own people, reviewing our aid policy, which the President ordered last May.
And yet, also in the same remarks, he slammed UN peacekeeping, he slammed the mission in the Western Sahara, he slammed the International Criminal Court and a few other bodies that are part of the structure put in place to try to solve some of these problems and police some of these problems.
Well, no, I think that's a mischaracterization of what Ambassador, I'm not speaking for Ambassador Bolton, but what he said. What he didn't slam was not the objectives of the missions. What he slammed was the fact that they go on year after year after year ad infinitum with no objectives, no benchmarks against which those objectives are measured. And he was very clear about it, that the U.S. is not going to support that, whether it be at multilateral institutions or in our bilateral aid policies.
Joao.
Well, I think this is very, very important. That when I go back to the second pillar, which is the military, I think, pillar that you mentioned, which is security, precisely. I think this is a time where regional organizations are understanding that it's very difficult to rely on the multilateral system. And when I said earlier, whether it's NATO or the United Nations, it's going to be very difficult because people are more inward looking and looking at their own security, collective security, than sending troops to other regions. That's a fact. Now, how do you respond to that? And I think the US, with the new strategy, is looking at bilateral, direct support to the African Union in general, or relationship with the African member state in general. So what will be then the role of all the multinational organizations, and how do you define today maintaining global peace and solving some of the conflict that we have, for example, on the continent? And I said it last year here in this tribune, and I will say it again, maintaining global peace is a global responsibility. Even if regional organizations today are putting together measures to actually take care of their own challenges. But the challenges today are transnational. They are unprecedented. What happened in my neighbor's courtyards affect me if I don't take care of it. So I think for me that the critical question today is to say, how do we then look at the multilateral system when it comes to security, providing security provision across the world, not only for Europe, not only for the US, not only for the allies, but the entire world where you have conflict that have this effect of spillover effect, but also with local manifestation, threats with local manifestation, but with global reach. I think that's, for me, the critical question today.
I'd like to support what Michel just said. I think it's very important to keep this in mind. The regional organization, alliances, and so on should be part of a system that contributes to global security. I haven't had the pleasure of reading Ambassador Bolton's speech yet, and I would not comment in any case. But from what Peter said and from what you said, I think there's a fundamental issue here which needs to be discussed, and I have a few colleagues from the United Nations here. I see the Ambassador of Jamaica and a part from the Ambassador of Morocco as well. And we are discussing that in the UN about prevention and operational capacity to help peacekeeping, peacemaking, sustaining peace, and all that. This is a major task. For that, we need multilateralism. For that, you need institutions.
And yet,
for that, you need International Criminal Court to make people accountable towards the global public opinion. There's nothing we can do, regardless of our individual efforts and goodwill, which I don't doubt, if you don't have this system that brings actors, countries, people together to guarantee global peace.
Let me just and respond to Michel. I think one of the unheralded successes in recent years has been how much individual African states, operating perhaps collectively, but as individual states, have stepped up to the plate. 10 years ago, African countries contributed not even 40% of the peacekeeping presence in Africa. Today, that's well over 60%. So that's something individual African states can be very proud of. They did it. And we're proud of in the United States for having helped them with it. In that same decade, the U.S. has trained peacekeepers in over 20 African countries. And we've helped, and we've been happy to partner, and we will continue to partner with it. We have a representative of the U.S. Africa Command here working on that to partner with them, and it's one of the unheralded successes of Africa in the last decade.
But two counterpoints. First of all, hasn't the U.S. shrunk the AFRICOM mission? But then to everybody else, as Secretary of State Albright said yesterday, institutions, when they're 70, shouldn't we look at them again? And may I also point out that yesterday, just as Ambassador Bolton was attacking the record of UN peacekeepers, Amnesty International also released a report questioning the alleged murder of 100 internally displaced people in the CAR, and asked, why didn't the peacekeepers keep them safe? So we have both sides there. Peter, why did the AFRICOM mission shrink?
I'm not sure what you're referring to, actually, in the AFRICOM mission shrinking. If you look at the sheer number of engagements, personnel, et cetera, AFRICOM has never been more engaged on the African continent than it is today. I'll defer to General Craig for the statistics on that, but it's actually more engaged now than it has been in the 10 years it's existed as an independent combatant command.
And how about the institutions?
Now, on the missions, let's be clear.
Yeah.
As Secretary Albright said, we all need to do some refurbishing and whatever when we reach certain age, and that counts for us personally as well. At least as far as I'm concerned, I'm very much aware of that. So, no question about that. What is the first priority of the present Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres? Reform, reform, reform. We are supporting him. The US is supporting him as well. Across the board, the UN needs to be adapted.
There's agreement
like NATO needs to adapt, as we said earlier. We need to adapt this institution. That does not mean that we should destroy them. By the way, if we were to recreate UN today, we couldn't. We would not be able. So before we destroy anything that doesn't work entirely well, let's think about the alternative. Let's think about the costs of the alternatives to systems that we have today. So we are determined to reform the United Nations, as well as we are determined to make the missions, the UN missions, work better. There's a whole lot of activity going on in New York to do exactly that. In 80% of this agenda, I think we agree with the US. We have our differences, but the focus should be make these missions more operational. Sometimes they are peacekeepers, they have no peace to keep, right? And sometimes they are not equipped in terms of mandate or means to do what they should do to protect people, like you said. So there's a lot going on. But before we throw the baby out with the bathwater, let's think whether we are capable of making another baby.
Just one moment. I think we should avoid mixing two things. UN operation, and so on, and the NATO. I think the issue is the NATO. And I started by saying I'm from a generation who grew up seeing NATO as promoting, though it was not necessarily complete, freedom, economic, political, and so on, versus one-party system, oppression, and silence, though we lived under that. Now, talking of UN reform, I served a number of years in the UN, and I'm very happy to see Ambassador Sawyer here, who was permanent member UK. So we know what talking about when it comes to reforming the UN and the difficulties, complexities, and the need to come on it every 5 to 10 years. There is a commission to reform UN peacekeeping, peace building. Even after leaving UN, I came back on peace reform. For me, this is not the point. The point today, we are in a very, very difficult world. A world, despite critics, established and protected by democracies. Again, come of my generation one-party system where people were sent behind bar in our countries. I'm not talking of Gulag and so on. NATO democracies, despite their shortcomings, were seen as promoting a number of freedoms, economic and so on. Would it continue? How to adapt to a changing environment with more active international actors, China more than Russia, for instance, or regional power. The point is not how to fund African Union. Why not? But African Union, maybe people would like it, but they prefer maybe bilateral, French, British, or American, as you said, African people are happy with, or French cooperation in the Sahel, and so on. The point is, what will happen, and I'm not American or NATO, but I'm defending NATO as something promoting stability and freedom. Again, coming back to the early basis versus one-party system, dictatorship, and so on. So what to do? And the UN reform is an endless exercise, which is good. You know, the same way European Union, where I served as ambassador, need to be reformed in spending and so on. So.
With that, I would like to invite questions from the audience. Wondering if I could put General Craig, is he in here? Would you mind answering that AFRICOM question?
Yep.
If you could introduce yourself for those who weren't here yesterday.
So everyone, I'm Major John Craig. I'm the Director for Strategy, Engagement, and Plans at US AFRICOM. And so, rightly, as Dr. Pham spoke here a little bit, I think really kind of stepping back, big picture, we look at those publicly available national strategic documents and national defense strategies coming out. And you see that where the U.S. is looking right now is to...
Sorry, could I interrupt you? Where can he step that he can be seen in the camera? Yeah. Oh, you got him? Okay.
Got me. All right, I'm there. And what I was going to say is, you take a look at those top-line documents, you'll recognize that the United States is very clear in talking about focusing on readiness right now and focusing on efficiencies that go to that. And so I think in any organization we have, we're looking at efficiencies. And there's been much discussion about things like reductions is the words to use, optimization. Yes, I would argue there are some counter-terror, CT, counter-VEO elements where we've used the word. I would actually personally rather use the word rebalance. We've been rebalancing a little bit of the force and looking at that as those go forward. So exactly Dr. Pham's point, there has not been, I mean, the amount of engagement, the amount of commitment, the amount of funding, the amount of folks that are on the ground doing real engagements with our partners continues and will continue. But I think like all organizations, we're continually looking at how do we rebalance and how do we reorganize to make the most impact that we have for those nations on the continent. So
you're saying that basically what has been reported as a reduction is instead a shifting of resources? I would say so. I'd say there's definitely a rebalancing when you start taking a look at any of the efforts that are on there. Some of the missions that we had, you'll see nations that are well along on the path. And so maybe I'll give you an example where you have a 12-man team on the ground that has been training, advising, assisting, but they're at the point where now they're graduated, they're there. And now we sit there as a nation and go, okay, should we move those 12 folks somewhere else rather than continue that and then look at other avenues? Because as we talked about yesterday, there's a whole portfolio we look at AFRICOM that is not just the military element. It's a very small element of what we need to do to support partners on the African continent. And it really, truly is really a commitment to how do we support as a military those diplomacy and those development efforts. Hence the reason, as I talked about yesterday, we really do have State Department and our Agency for International Development embedded within our staff, so that we're trying to work across a whole portfolio of resources, not just focused on those military monies or people, but all of the U.S. government effort on the continent. Michelle, is that how it feels? As I walk up and pick up the microphone.
I would say there are different responses to that. I believe that, yes, the bilateral cooperation in terms of technical support, capacity building with AFRICOM is well appreciated. But there is currently, and I think I would like to echo some of the discussion that we had earlier, it's about through all of these efforts, the militarization of the continent. And I think that's actually one of the policy debates that is being put forward, not only at the African Union, but even member state questioning. If we look at the Horn of Africa, for example, in the Red Sea, there is currently a number of concern about having military bases across the continent, and what will be what will be the purpose of having several military bases precisely on some part of the continent. So shifting resources, adjusting, does it mean militarization more militarization of the continent? And that's the question I'm putting forward to all of us, but also to the audience, because those are the debates that we are having at regional level as well.
So perhaps what the U.S. press corps sees as a shrinking of emission is actually a demand signal from African nations that they want to be able to stand for themselves rather than have a foreign base.
Can I just say one thing at this point? Because I don't want this to be only a debate concerning the U.S. and Africa.
Yeah.
As far as France is concerned and its partners on the ground, we really want African countries to take up their security by themselves. In fact, that's the whole plan. The G5 Sahel is about that, precisely. I think that it's taking more time than many of us would like to. But if you ask the French military and the French authorities, they would love to be able to reduce their own military presence in the Sahel region. The more African countries step up and take up their own security by themselves, especially, but not limited to counterterrorism, I think the happier Western countries which actually have an oversized role on the continent will be. So this is not only, as the general knows, I mean, it's not only by the way, there's excellent French-American military cooperation in the Sahel for counterterrorism. I want to make that clear. I want to make that on the record, because we all talk about transatlantic disputes, including French-American spats, but on the ground, and I hope you will not contradict me in general, because that would be very embarrassing. But the French-American military cooperation is absolutely excellent on the ground.
Peter, you would have... Or getting you a mic.
No, this is just it's completely reinforced, and and I should have also segued too that much of what we talk about when you start looking at rebalancing is increasing, and not just increasing, just enhancing the partnerships we already have on the continent. So literally 2 days ago, I was in N'Djamena, Chad, hanging out with the 2-star French commander for Operation Barkhane, comparing notes, especially with our multinational joint task force down there that is collective with African-led, African partners leading the way, and a very strong French presence there. So no, I'm just reinforcing that's exactly the case in that region.
And that's often what I hear in Washington, that yes, you might see these angry statements going back and forth in the diplomatic sphere, but that the military cooperation undergirds all.
Very much. 2 quick points. Very, very true. Just to reinforce that, and one of the examples actually the Ambassador Bolton cited yesterday, as a positive example, was actually our cooperation on the G5 Sahel, which I agree with. It's very important for our interests as well as the security and stability of our friends and partners. To Michelle's point, I want to follow very quickly. The rebalancing that's needed is not only within the military resources that General Craig spoke about, but also broader, because I think there's a recognition, and it's in the Trump administration's Africa strategy, that it can't be only security, that there's the governance part and there's the development part. And most people haven't recognized there's a lot of talk internationally and in the United States about how divided government is on dysfunctional. One of the few things that passed in recent months, the U.S. Congress overwhelmingly in both the House of Representatives and the Senate, and signed into law by President Trump in early October, was the U.S. Build Act, which overhauls our development finance, creating a new U.S. International Development Finance Corporation with a $60 billion authorization specifically to invest in developing economies, most of which will eventually be invested in African countries.
I'm just going to take 2 questions here. I think you had a question. Can you stand up and introduce yourself?
I am from the Jamaican Mission in New York. I just wanted to pick up on something that Minister Abdallah said. I mean, you stressed the bedrock foundational principles of NATO: democracy, rule of law, individual liberty and freedom. And I'm wondering, I mean, the question for the panel is posed in really existential terms. Can NATO survive? And I'm wondering, some have said that one of the biggest threats to NATO comes from within the democratic regression among some of its own members, which exposes them more to Russian subversion, these rising illiberal tendencies among some of the NATO countries. And you heard Madeleine Albright yesterday say some of that. And I just wonder, to what extent do you agree with some of these commentators that some of the threat is coming from within in terms of this trend?
So, rising populism among NATO members.
Yeah.
Good point.
Thank you. Thank you. I think you asked the right question, and you asked it within the theme of our conference, which is not how to help Africa, which is important, but the point is about NATO. And despite shortcomings, it was an era where NATO member states were democratic, freedom lover, and supporting it, though not 100%, in our countries. And that was very important. During the Cold War, NATO member states, again, people have a memory. We didn't start only now. During the Cold War, Western democracies, all members of the NATO alliance, were supporting democracy and freedom, though not 100%, but at least showing. And that democracy, that freedom, are threatened today through South Africa, or in large number of African countries, by terrorism, by some governmental practices also. Anyone fighting terrorism may ask people, help me because I have a threat, Islamist terrorism. As 40 years ago, help me, I am anti-communist. So we have to review to be efficient with this freedom. And I hope I answered at least partly to your question. There is a need to associate NATO military intervention to freedom, business, trade, and personal freedoms.
Bruno, you seem to have a different take.
No, I actually want to reinforce what has been said, and I think the question by the Jamaican ambassador is right to the point. I think it's very difficult today for NATO to project an image of a beacon of liberal democracy when you have at least one member country which is destroying the rule of law, another member country which happens to be an EU member, which is slowly also destroying the rule of law.
Care to name any of these people?
What?
Care to name any of these countries?
Yeah, Turkey and Hungary. Sure. I'm not a diplomat. I should name names.
Yeah.
So, but there are other examples. So you cannot make, it's impossible for NATO today to say, hey, we're a beacon of liberal democracy. No. And it's actually not, forgive me, Minister, it's not true that during the Cold War, NATO members were all liberal democracies. No, there were times where, as you know, some of them were not exactly democratic countries. But the system held because we thought there was a bigger stake. The bigger stake was that we thought the communism threat was a bigger threat than the threat to only liberal democracies inside. And I'm not sure this can still be the case today. I think the problem, I don't think this will destroy NATO from the inside. No, I think it's a bigger problem for the EU than for NATO. Because as long as we can agree that there are military and security-related threats we all need to defend against and protect against, then it's a secondary problem. So I see your point, and I hear you, Minister, but I think this is actually a bigger problem for the EU than for NATO, even though, once again, coming back to my earlier points, it's very hard to say today that all NATO members share all the same interests and the same values. I'm not sure we all share the same priorities in terms of interests And I'm definitely certain we don't all share the same values.
So we have a couple of questions on the app. I'm going to take one of those and a question for the audience. When will Europe step up and increase defense spending to be able to project real military power? All right, let's combine this with, and could you introduce yourself?
Sorry, John Soares, used to be head of British intelligence and British ambassador at the United Nations as well. I wanted to pick up on these questions which are appearing on the app because Ambassador Vale de Almeida made a welcome point about European political commitment to to strengthening defence capability. But I'm sorry to say, actually, there's not much progress being made on that. When you look at the budgets of Germany, Italy, Spain, they're still stuck, little above 1%, let alone approaching 2%. And when you look at the capability of Germany's armed forces, for example, it's almost zero. They've got no capacity to deploy military force and to assert defensive capability. And that's a really serious problem because if the European countries don't pull their weight, and at the moment only really France and Britain amongst the major European countries are doing that, then you're going to find the United States much less interested. I don't welcome President Trump's approach, but essentially Article 5 now is not a coherent and credible absolute commitment to Europe's defence. We want it to be, but the reality is that President Trump will decide whether it is in given circumstances. So that's my observation. My question is to Bruno and to the EU ambassador, is whether President Macron's aspiration, or is it a fantasy, of a European army is actually helping the credibility of NATO. Because there is no realistic prospect in the next 30 years of Europe having an army in any sense that we can understand it, but the pretensions to having one, the aspirations to having one, are only going to lead to the coherence of the transatlantic alliance getting weaker. That would be my observation, but I'd welcome Bruno's comments on that in particular.
Cheers. Bruno.
Yeah. Thank you very much for the question. And I'm glad that it came out so late in the conversation because I think it's a non-problem in a sense. I personally criticize the use of the expression European army by Macron and Merkel. But I think that the biggest problem is that it has been misunderstood, and that's all the French fault, by the way. What was meant to be a vision or an organizing principle was taken literally. But there's no plan, no intention, and no reason in the French system to plan for a separate European army at this point. It's all about saying we need Europe to be able to take care of itself more and more, and the United States should welcome that, by the way. And by the way, there's one thing we have not talked about, is the American interest, because I'm jumping back and forth within your question, because I don't believe that the notion that the US will cease to have an interest in European security if the Europeans want to take care of defense and security themselves is really a logic that applies in the real world. Forgive me for saying so, because I know that you've have your hands in the real world throughout your career, but I think it's a political argument that I hear from time to time, that I've been hearing for more than 20 years, by the way, and I'm not sure it's real. First of all, because the United States has an interest in staying in Europe for its own sake, including for economic and industrial interests, for instance. Anyone F-35? Okay, that's one question about many. So but let's go back to the question of European army. It's a misunderstanding, and I'll, again, blame the French, but it's not about creating an army. It's about reinforcing national and multinational European defense capabilities so that they are able to do two things. First of all, to uphold their NATO commitments, because stronger European countries means a stronger NATO. And second, when and where the US is unwilling or unable to participate in an operation, be able to act on their own. So it's not about creating a separate European army. It's not about competing with NATO. It might be about, and John, you know, it's a long-standing British-French debate. It is about creating additional layers of command for a very cheap, modest price, I assure you, so that the EU is able to organize, plan, conduct direct operations by itself, if and when the US is not interested, but it's not a plan for a separate European army. And last word on that, if I may, because it's really an important subject and there's been a lot of misunderstanding. This organizing principle, this vision, call it whatever you want, is sometimes needed for EU countries as a motivating political principle that helps garnering the support of public opinions for increased defense spending. Hey, we're not doing that for the United States of America. We're doing this for ourselves. We're doing this for our nation, for our country, for Europe also. So I think that all in all, there's a little bit of misunderstanding about that, and I hope these misunderstandings are clear. And final word to say that, as you know, John, one of the reasons for the French-led European intervention initiative is also to ensure that the UK, wherever its future might be, is continue to be tied up to European security and European defense as much as possible.
Now, as you all respond to that, I just want to pile on with one of the questions up there is, is the U.S. shouldering an outsized burden financially in NATO? And then to you, Peter, to John's point about, well, does Article 5 really count or only when President Trump feels like it?
I want to come back to Ambassador Sawyer's point. I subscribe entirely to what Bruno said about what we mean by European army, what we mean by European strengthening capabilities, and what he said about the political discourse and the political narrative that has to support that. My point, I don't know if you were already here when I made a few points about my opinion about the 2% debate, which I again say I think it's a narrow way of looking at it. But taking your point, and I like your British style, and I'll respond in the same style. I mean, you cannot in the same intervention criticize us for not doing enough and then criticize us for doing too much. We are not doing enough, you say, on military spending, and then you say that we are saying too much about our ideas about the future.
Wait, just a second, so that our
I agree that the concept of a European army is no more than just a framework for more defence cooperation, and that is important. Although it does, of course, make it more difficult for my own country to find its stability again after the mess we're going through at the moment. But it's this question of whether the aspiration is simply not matched by the reality of defence capability coming through in major countries. So
now, let me give you a couple of comments on that. It's also about defence capability as such, the military means and all that. And as we said earlier, we are making progress on that front. But there's more than that. There's more than that. The European concept is one of single market, integrated policies, common efforts, common budgetary lines, common programs about it. There's nothing on the defense and security side yet. So there's a lot of progress we can make in simply making it a more rational process. Why should we develop 4 or 5 helicopters projects in Europe? Why not join efforts and have a single project to build a European military helicopter? Why should we have 28 defense markets instead of a single market for defense? Why should we have 28 defense research budgets instead of putting everything together and having a critical mass that the United States has, by the way, with, ramifications and byproducts for civilian purposes coming out of military research? I'm giving you a few elements of things that we can do, and we are doing, and I said in the last 2 years we did more than in the 60 years past, about upgrading, making it more efficient, the efforts that we are making. And this is not only about, I'm sorry, buying F-35. That is not the measure of our commitment to defense. How many F-35s have we bought in the last 6 months? That is not a rational, honest, balanced way of measuring European commitment to security. So in this broader picture that I want to convey to you as part of our efforts today, do we need to say European army or not? I won't get into that debate myself. What I see is the need for us to mobilize our public opinion for the new security threats, working together with that. Nothing of this that I've been referring, and Bruno as well, is done against NATO. All this is done with and in complementarity with NATO. Because again, in our treaties, NATO is a foundation for our security, for the countries who are members of NATO, and that's the great majority of the members of the European Union. So together with NATO, in complementarity with NATO, adapting to the new threats, and maximizing our internal capabilities, more defense spending, but all the rest that I've said, I think we are on the right track, and I think a number of external factors have contributed to that, as some of us were saying, but that's been the whole construction of European Union, or NATO, has been impacted and stimulated by external factors as well. The combination of the two. Last remark on the domestic, on the point made by Courtney, the Jamaican ambassador, which are the internal threats. And populism was mentioned. I don't think populism is an exclusive of Europe, right? Certainly other countries are facing that around the world. It's not even a Western issue as such. It's an issue of our societies where you have, for different reasons, we don't have time to go into that, our establishments are being challenged. Sometimes with external support and external intervention, which becomes also a security problem. And we have to address this issue in its complexity. But again, it's not only a European issue, as you know very well, but it's one that we need to factor in seriously.
So, Peter, can you just take that one point that to Article 5, that it's only as good as President Trump's commitment to it?
Well, I don't presume to speak for the president, but I would say as an American, I cannot help but be grateful to the one and only occasion in the history of NATO when Article 5 was invoked by the alliance was after the attack on 9/11 on the American homeland. And I think as an American, one has to recognize that and be grateful for the support that was offered. That was why NATO was created. And I think it's the basis from which we have to respond to future threats in like manner.
So, one last.
My name is Vladimir Volshenyuk. I am from Ukraine. I have no questions. I'd like to ask you to remember that for 4 years of Russian aggression on the territory of Ukraine were killed more than 10,000 people. During the war in Afghanistan for 10 years were killed 15,000 soldiers. So in the process of your reforms and discussions, remember please this event. Thank you.
I wanted to ask, did we have that word cloud that I'd first asked? Did we get results from that? Or people were still caffeinating, just perhaps? So, on that note, I would like to give everyone on the panel an opportunity to give us a prediction. What do you see as NATO's biggest threat that it's going to have to deal with in the next 5 years? Michelle?
Well, I think I would like to bounce back on what the ambassador of Jamaica said. Initially...
if I could just interrupt. They did put the word cloud, a question up. If anyone wants to chime in as our panelists talk about this, you have about a minute to put your answers in. Sorry.
No, yeah, I was saying that they would like to bounce back on what the ambassador of Jamaica said earlier about the internal threats. And I think we need to consider that very seriously because NATO wasn't only actually a military cooperation organization, but also the champion of the world liberal order. So when that liberal order is shrinking, you need to ask yourself if the purpose and the mission set for yourself is still relevant, and how do you then adjust and deal with those threats? And I think for me what is very important as we move forward is to say, is NATO going to continue to be relevant? And I'm looking at it from a global perspective, not only for a collective security perspective. So there was a role that was also allocated to NATO to play a global security champion. Will that role stand when nations are more inward-looking and are more concerned with their own collective security?
So NATO has to adapt or fade away into a lack of mission. So,
yes.
Minister.
Well, I think it is a good debate, though as usual short, which is normal. Again, I put myself in long-term perspective because I associated NATO to freedom and democracy, though as mentioned, I remember very well, Portugal was not a democracy at that time, or Spain before 75, 76, or our countries were protected by NATO, quote unquote. But globally, political civilization countries within NATO were promoting general freedom. That, in my opinion, remains relevant, especially in view of current threats, extremism, terrorism. And we should avoid what happened during the Cold War, supporting anyone claiming to be anti-communist, or today, though those people were supporting only the regime survival. Today also the threat is anyone saying I am against terrorism should need support. Maybe they are supporting only
so NATO needs to
but we need
adapt.
Overall a strong NATO. I'm not saying culture, NATO as organization, US and Europe, and because the world evolved, maybe some other countries in Latin America or in North Africa to constitute the same type of alliance in view of mounting threats, who are not necessarily Islamists or terrorists, but other system of economies, other development.
So you're saying that the answer is that as NATO might recede in relevance, Africa steps up for itself?
Well, I see, for instance, again, I don't like to be very cheap in saying how about more influence of China. And I think personally China will evolve. In 20 years, 50 years, China will be more open, more democratic, probably. What will happen to a number of small countries who are hubs for corrupt money? NATO was a kind of paramount, and again, I'm not angelic about NATO that everything, but behind NATO there were great countries defending a number of freedom, economic and liberty.
So I apologize, we only have a couple minutes left, so I'm going to ask you guys to do a lightning round. Peter, the word cloud questions above that you might have seen is the greatest threat NATO will face in the next 5 years. The largest number of answers was Trump, then climate change, and then geopolitics. So is NATO threatened by Trump?
I would say no, and also I would say the greatest threat, actually, I would echo the minister just slightly, is staying focused. NATO, as my friend here emphasized, is a military organization. And it's an effective military organization. But military organizations are effective insofar as they have clarity of mission and the resources to carry out that mission. And those are the two things. If we don't have that clarity of mission, and there's that danger, with all due respect, it's one thing to engage other countries, other partners. We always seek that. We're here in Morocco, which is the United States' oldest treaty ally and friend, the longest standing treaty relationship we have. But that It doesn't mean Morocco is it's a major NATO, non-NATO ally, but it's not a member of NATO. So the mission creep, I would say, of expanding willy-nilly and not being focused, I think, is the danger to the military alliance.
Correct.
Yeah, I'm interested by the result of what you showed on the screen, because I still think that the biggest challenge in the next 5 years for NATO is and will remain Russia, because the alliance and NATO itself was not designed to face a multifaceted offensive such as the one that Putin's Russia, because it's Putin's Russia, is that I love Russia. People in France sometimes say, oh, you don't like Russia. No, I love Russia as a country. You know? That's the biggest challenge. But let me just add that exactly 20 years ago, one of my first journal articles was called Will NATO Survive in 2009? Okay? And I was enumerating all the reasons, external and internal, why one could have doubt about the solidity of the alliances 10 years later. So we should all be careful about the predictions that we made about strong institutions can remain strong and don't disappear. Like, they can be weakened, but they won't disappear. So my prediction for 2029 is that NATO will probably celebrate its 80th birthday.
Good. Sir.
Well, what I'd like to see is a capable and effective NATO adapted to the new security threats, and there are a number of them, which we mentioned earlier. I would like to see NATO having a very solid cooperation with the European Union. I would like to see a strengthened and reinvigorated Atlantic alliance from the political angle. And I would like to see Africa, the African Union, African countries as such, sub-regional organizations playing a much more important role in ensuring African citizens' security. And I would like to see all this as part of reinvigorating effective multilateralism. That is my wish for the future. We'll discuss in a couple of years again, if you invite me, and see whether it materialized or not. I hope it will.
Well, with that, I would like to thank the panelists, thank the Policy Center for the New South, and thank all of you for your questions, and invite you to enjoy coffee outside.
Well done.
Thank you. And we ended on time.
Ladies and gentlemen, we will now take a short break for coffee and reconvene at 10:45. We will reconvene at 10:45. Thank you.